Welcome back to Model Minority Uniquely American. I'm Nidhi Shastri, and this is part 2 of Crazy Not So Rich Asians. So, in the last half, we left off with the story of Helena Koo-ri, a Korean-American author of the children's book, The Paper Kingdom. Helena's story is one of many. I've interviewed a good amount of people for Model Minority so far, and here's just a fraction of excerpts where people share their stories of being Asian and having similar economic strain.
I feel like my parents faced economic hardships both here and in India because my dad grew up with 5 siblings, and he was raised by a single mom, and that was hard because in India it's such a patriarchal society, and usually men are seen as the ones who should be providing for the family, and it's also harder for women, especially back in the day, to even get a job there or an education. And then my mom, I know, grew up in a 1-bedroom apartment, and then eventually her family started their own business. So they did face hardships when they were younger, and then after coming here, they worked very hard to just make sure that they're able to have a place, and then insurance and everything. And then growing up, I feel like there were a lot of times when I couldn't have everything that other people had. And for example, I know it's not a big deal now when I think about it, but when you're younger, like, people make fun of you because you're wearing a certain type of shoe or something. But I was never able to tell my parents that because I knew that we could never buy a certain thing. So I feel like growing up, that made me feel kind of I'm being bullied, but I don't know what to do about it. My dad came here first in the 80s, and then my mom came here after she got married. Both of them went to college in India, but neither of their degrees are usable here. They're not valid. Didn't have the resources or the money to ever go to college here. And that's one of the biggest adversities I've seen growing up is my dad would talk about when he first came here, he would work 24-hour shifts at a hot dog stand, or he's had a lot of jobs that would require him to work 12 plus hours a day. Even right now, he usually leaves at 5:30 and comes back around 8. So just seeing both my parents, and my mom works at the post office, she worked really odd hours sometimes, just seeing how much work they have to do to make ends meet, and not even having the chance to prove their education that they might have had here is something that I've seen growing up. And I feel like that's very common for a lot of my cousins and some of my friends as well, who are also Indian, and I feel like that's pretty unfair.
That's my friend Shruti. I met her in college, and she grew up in an Indian American household, much like myself, that's low income. And here's my friend Ali, who I grew up with, talking a bit about his socioeconomic status experience as an Indian and Pakistani American.
My name is Ali. I'm from a suburb of Chicago, Illinois, Hanover Park. I'm currently studying law at Marquette University Law School in Milwaukee. I would say that I'm Asian in the larger sense. My mom and dad are from India and Pakistan, respectively. So I don't necessarily identify with one of those countries over the other. My dad is a security guard. He's worked as a security guard for about over 20 years. He started working as a security guard shortly after, a few years after his arrival in the United States. Growing up, both my parents grew up very poor. My mom, her father passed away when she was really young, and my dad, lived in a farmland area of Pakistan, a very rural area. And while they kind of just were, a lot of the society was very agrarian. My dad worked from a very young age. My dad has been working since his early preteens up until now. And even being in the United States, we've had to face financial adversity. We've, battled with food stamps and free lunch and all of that. And even now, we continue to see that. And it's a very difficult thing at times, facing the hardship. And also going off of that, I started working early as well, me and my siblings. We started working as soon as we were allowed to, in order to help out around the house. My mom has a really severe diagnosis of asthma, which prevents her from doing a lot of activity or a lot of work. So when it got to be very serious, me and my brother stepped in and started paying the bills around the house. And I've been working. I worked all the way through undergrad. I worked through high school, through my upper level classes, through my upper levels in high school, and I work now in law school as well. And it's a struggle, but it's something that we have to do.
And my friend Jordan, who's Lao American, also has a similar story, and he also grew up in my area. He shared his experience about being Southeast Asian and facing economic hardship.
My name is Jordan Mio, and my parents are from Laos. It's pretty much a country by Thailand. But I grew up pretty much around Chicago, around the Chicagoland area. And right now I'm studying animal science and going to pre-vet at UIUC. And yeah, my ethnicity is Lao. My family grew up in a working class society, I guess. So I always grew up pretty much having to work for everything I have. That was one of the big things where a lot of times we didn't have a lot of money for extra things. We either had enough money for what we needed or sometimes not even enough money for that. So that was kind of a struggle growing up, not really having luxurious things or just barely getting by. And so that kind of shaped me into the person who just always grew up working to pretty much get what I want and need. It kind of was a struggle because it kind of brought me to a place where I had to work and do school at the same time. So a lot of my time was taken away. If I wanted something, I kind of just had to work towards that. The struggle of balancing school plus actual work was kind of hard because I've been working since I was around 16, 17. And yeah, I've always felt I've always have to work just to feel like I had enough.
These are just a fraction of people who don't fit the model minority mold. You can find dozen more stories like these just in Chicago and its surrounding suburbs alone. It's often hard to put a face to a number and personify the stats we read in an article or hear in the news or even learn on this podcast. But what ends up happening is the erasure of an entire history of struggle and sacrifice from a significant racial group. Additionally, like Helena shared in her story, the line to economic mobility can sometimes change in the relative blink of an eye, meaning within 1 or 2 generations. Let's unravel the stats just a little more. According to a study undertaken by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, 1 in 5 AAPIs experience discrimination in the rental and home buying process. Furthermore, as of 2016, AAPIs have suffered the largest percentage decline in home ownership of any racial group, and their home ownership rate falls well below the national average. Often, you'll find particularly South Asians housing multiple families in one house. While Asians tend to be equated with whites in the United States, many white Americans are able to inherit wealth that is compounded over time within their families, who have been for generations in America. They thus have assets and leeway to make mistakes. And although I do know that this is not always the case, more often for model minority immigrants and first gens, we are building ourselves up and our history up from scratch. That means that if we lose it all, we really hit rock bottom. In the past week, I sat down with Alankrita Sadullah, an Indian American med student from Chicago, and her story resonated with me in a lot of different ways. She touches on this very concept of starting from scratch.
My name is Alankrita Sadullah. I'm from Chicago, and I'm currently in my last year at Rush Medical College. with the hopes of continuing onto a general surgery residency next year. And I'm South Asian. Yeah, so I'm a first-generation immigrant. My family came here to Chicago when I was about 7. Definitely before we immigrated, we were struggling economically, and that was the biggest reason for immigrating to America. Fulfilling that American. Oh, sorry, my dog's like whining. Oh, okay, calm down. Okay, the idea of fulfilling that American dream of being able to achieve more social status by being in America through the various opportunities they have and the amount of money you'll be making. So, because we were in a financially hard place in India, that was the biggest reason we immigrated to America. But because my parents didn't have as much education, there were only certain few jobs that they could work, and since they didn't have a mastery of the language, they had to depend on Asian employers while they were here, or self-employed as a taxi driver. So that meant very low wages, lower than minimum wage sometimes, because Asian employers can be very stingy with that. And so even in this country, my family was facing economic hardship by living like paycheck to paycheck, and this whole idea of trying to advance in society, requires education, which is expensive in this country and not something that you can freely get. And like most American families, my family couldn't really save up enough at any given point to try to advance our position. And, things would always pop up, whether it be like car trouble or losing work or, any kind of fixes to the house, anything random, of course, would deplete any little savings that we were able to acquire. And it's no surprise to anyone in that situation as an immigrant or as a low-income person that being poor is very expensive in this country. We have set up this whole system that makes it hard for people to advance up the social ladder, especially immigrants that don't have the safety net that a lot of citizens do in terms of welfare. So, in the end, my family's only hope at doing well was raising their kids well enough to, do well, and as a result, bring them up in status. So that puts a lot of pressure, of course, on immigrant children. It put a lot of pressure on myself and my sister to do well, to make a lot of money in the future so we can take care of them and give them a comfortable life that I never got to have. I think a lot of immigrants, regardless of race or ethnicity, share this same struggle. So I think the model minority myth, going back to that, hides the fact that the struggle is the same for all immigrants, regardless of ethnicity and race, and doesn't allow them to feel like they're part of the same struggle. But it also kind of makes Asians powerless to try to fight the circumstances that they're in, to ask for more, for better, to be guaranteed healthcare, to have access to welfare or more opportunities in terms of education. So they're supposed to keep quiet and just work hard. Hard work will get them everything that they need. They just got to keep on working hard instead of demanding, that their rights be fulfilled. My parents are divorced, so since the age of 14, my sister and I have been with my mother. And so she didn't have an opportunity to finish her education in India. She had very little idea of how to deal with finances in this country. So we kind of had to grow up fast and help her and deal with it as a family rather than having this like parent-child dynamic. So we know exactly, how much she makes, how much she has saved up, what her retirement looks like. We have an idea of all of this and have to calculate it into our planning for the future. So that's definitely different from a lot of other families where the kids can, grow up at their own pace. They can consider their own desires of what they want to do with their life. And if they screw up, then they're just screwing up their own life. They're not necessarily taking away the chance that their parents might have had at living a comfortable life.
Last episode, we talked about how funding for aid to single mothers or low-income families and scholarships for college are often not offered to the Asian community at all due to a mythological perception of how hard Asians work and the money we make, and more importantly, our conservative, money-saving style of living, aka the stereotype of being cheap. However, even despite this rep of being cheap, there is a lot of hard work, cutting corners, and even hungry nights involved with the wealth that Asian Americans eventually accrue over time or use for higher education. And as for being cheap, I'll say this. Immigrants from other countries who have seen the worst of things, seen and faced hardship, hunger, sacrifice, know how important every single dollar and cent that we have is. And I don't want to sound too much like a lecturing brown auntie, but I can say that I was raised to know the value of every penny or dime that I spend. As someone surrounded by model minority communities, I can tell you right now, Asians are some of the most giving, caring, and tight-knit communities you can find. In Hindi, there's actually a saying, "Mehman Bhagwan ke jaise hote hai," which means guests are akin to God and should be treated as such. You will seldom walk into an Indian household and leave without being offered a garam, hot cup of homemade chai, a snack, and some authentic desi love. Now, this economic difference between us penetrates even within our communities as well. I am very, very fortunate to have grown up and lived in the Chicagoland area, and in my neighborhood, these stories are the norm. They're much alike to my own story. But once I started going to college, I noticed a huge socioeconomic difference between myself and other Asians at the university. The good majority of people who looked like me did not have a background like me. Many of them were from wealthy suburbs and parts of wealthy families. I distinctly remember once I was sitting at a coffee table at a coffee shop on campus trying to study, and a group of South Asian students sat next to me, and they were talking really loudly and extensively about their upcoming Costa Rica spring break trip and how they were trying to convince their parents to agree to another expensive vacation. Meanwhile, I was grueling over my textbook, unable to focus, thinking about how I know how hard I have to work in order to do well and move up and make it to graduation and try to secure my future, not only for myself, but for my family, and to raise us out of the situation that we're in. That is the nature of the Asian wealth gap, as seen and felt right before my own eyes. I attended a huge public land-grant institution, and yet I constantly felt this way in Asian and South Asian spheres. And as we've seen in this episode, low-income and economically marginalized Asians clearly do exist in significant numbers. So we need to be asking, what are the barriers that keep them from attending universities like the one I did? It does, in my opinion, open the floor to a conversation about, again, who is being let in, whether that's to the USA as immigrants or to the opportunity of economic mobility through higher education. But enough about Asians for a second. Let's also not forget other potentially non-Asian model minorities or let them slip through the cracks. Let's start with Guyanese immigrants and Indo-Caribbeans. Now, often it's difficult for Indo-Caribbeans and Guyanese people to indicate their racial status on a form, and thus census data and stats are highly skewed and underrepresented for this particular demographic. And while many of them do identify as Asian or pay homage to their South Asian ancestry, others may have no connection to it whatsoever and feel that Asian is not a representative title for their ethnicity. But let's take a look at the stats that we do have. According to IndoCaribbean.org, in December of 2013, the NYC Department of City Planning issued a detailed report showing that Guyanese immigrants are the second largest immigrant group in Queens and the fifth largest in New York City. And more than half of all Guyanese immigrants and 40% of Trinidadian immigrants in the US live in New York City. The majority of Guyanese and Trinidadian communities are Indo-Caribbean, meaning they identify as South Asian and of Indian ancestry. And comparatively, 1 out of 3 New York City residents, foreign-born and native, had college experience or advanced degrees compared to only 16% and 15% of Guyanese and Trinidadian immigrants, respectively. And that 15% is also true for the amount of them that live in poverty. This issue is trying to keep Indo-Caribbean and Guyanese representation known, especially in the Asian and model minority communities. While they may initially look or be perceived as purely South Asian, much like how African immigrants are instantly perceived to be African American in the US, their history is vastly different and thus requires at times further nuance. Speaking of African immigrants, many times African immigrants are seen as more quote-unquote hardworking and better earners than their Black or African American community counterparts. Let's check back in with Dr. Barrow from the last episode to dig into this a little bit deeper.
So yeah, the myth is there, but I think sometimes we have to look at situations individually to kind of see where people came from, what they went through, and how their story became a success story. But really, we can't put everybody in one basket and say that, these people are all successful or they'll usually make it. Because when I think about people who come from various African countries and who are able to make it here in the US, like usually there's this myth about Nigerians that they're all very successful. Or the other myth is that, usually they go into these careers like they're all doctors. Well, maybe among those Nigerians are some who, the main goal was to come here and get an education, but who ended up being taxi drivers. It's not like I'm trying to put, any kind of prejudice or minimizing the work of a taxi driver, but I'm just saying that sometimes people set for themselves a goal that they're not able to reach because of several reasons. So I guess we just have to rethink it. The same goes with people coming from Asia, different countries in Asia. There's the same situation sometimes happens where we think that all Asians succeed. Well, maybe they do, but maybe some don't, or maybe some have decided to get into some fields that they actually didn't want to. So what is our view of success? How do we measure success? I guess that's where the question should be, really.
For example, if we go back to Andrew's work in the Mississippi Delta, he mentioned how the Asian community there has to find a place in the rural South, which led them to face a level of adversity that many East and West Coast Asians don't have to face in the same way.
Right. And it's like when you think about what success means, right? Like a lot of what people define success or see Asian Americans doing is, being doctors or lawyers or business folks. But what success looked like in the Delta was opening your grocery store, having a thriving grocery store so you can provide for your family and become a really successful small business entrepreneur. Like that is what success looked like. And that's how the legacies and the families were being able to pass on from generation to generation. So that in itself really dispels what almost success means.
Dispelling success. Maybe that should be the tagline for this podcast. But this theme of what success means is linked in many different ways to the construct of socioeconomic status. And like Dr. Barrow and Andrew touched on here, it varies significantly even within the model minority community. But let's return back now to Black and African immigrants. Although not all Black immigrants are African immigrants or even model minorities, the statistics on these groups tend to be aggregated. So let's start there. 1 out of 5, meaning 20% of Black immigrants live below the poverty line. And according to the Pew Research Center, poverty rates among Black immigrants vary as well. Some 22% of African immigrants live in poverty, as compared to 19% of those from Central America, 18% of those from the Caribbean, and 14% of those from South America. Additionally, African immigrant communities often end up, as Sammy, a friend of mine, said, in the shadows of America, as many people rely on bias and perception to label them.
So my full name is Samuel Gassessa. I go by Sammy though, and as of recently, I go by Sam. So I'm from Evanston, Illinois, and I currently go to U of I, and I'm studying TSM, which is also known as Technical Systems Management, and my ethnicity would be Black. My dad, my mom, like I said, came here through, I think it was the 70s or 80s, I want to say 70s, during a time when the country of Ethiopia was essentially recognized as a red state by the United States because it was essentially heavily communist. And at the time, there was a dictatorship that was ruling that was very violent. And and at the time, America was very much willing to help citizens of countries that were under communist rule seek refuge in their country, because to America's understanding, the Cold War was a very important war, and spreading the influence of democracy was a utmost priority for them. So my dad and my mom were able to find refuge here in the U.S. through applying for programs and that kind of a thing that would give them the ability to. And so essentially they were selected and they were given the opportunity to come to the U.S. And at that time, I know it was a lot easier to come here. But yeah, they made it here, and they definitely faced their own adversities, both of them in their own different ways, for sure. I know my mom had a pretty difficult time getting an education because of specific visa requirements and that kind of thing. Logistics that were related to the visa that she had were essentially stopping her from being able to continue her education and actually get a bachelor's degree. She does fine now. She's employed and she works as a nurse, and she's fine now. But she tells me that had she had the opportunity to continue her education, she would have. My dad, on the other hand, he actually drove taxi for a really long time in the city of Chicago before going to school in his 30s and getting his bachelor's and then his master's in CS. So until then, he definitely would acknowledge to me that he was struggling to make ends meet a significant amount of the time. He really, really had a hard time adapting to the weather of the Midwest, especially Chicago. But my dad and my mom were not alone in this. But yeah, no, they definitely had their own struggles that they tell me about that make me appreciate the situation that I've been given.
One of the biggest resources for African immigrants would be centers with language skills that are representative of their communities. Unfortunately, when people see somebody who is Black in America, they have a perceived notion of what it means beforehand, leaving African immigrants to fall through the cracks without cultural resources. We will talk more about African identity and identifiers in a later episode, but for now, let's talk about the intersection of another type of African immigrant, MENA, or Middle Eastern and North African immigrants. According to minorityrights.org, there are between 1.2 million and 3.5 million Arab Americans and immigrants living in the U.S. as of 2004. And according to research published by Georgetown's Law Center for Policy and Inequality in 2018, 23% of Arab Americans face poverty in the United States. The disparities amongst the country of origin matter as well, but because of what we talked about regarding census categories in the last episode, I will tell you that I had difficulty in finding up-to-date information on Middle Eastern and North African Americans. However, hopefully with the 2020 census, we can gain a better understanding of some of these stats. Now, much like Asian Americans, the proportion of Arab Americans overall with a high school diploma was higher than the total population, and the proportion of those with at least a bachelor's degree was even higher, 41% compared to 24% of the total population. It's important to note many Arab and Middle Eastern Americans face discrimination in housing and job markets due to their ethnicity and religion, much like South Asians. Also, having a degree or diploma, like Dr. Barrow expressed, does not guarantee a job in your field or what you have a degree in. Immigration and citizenship status is contingent for many on their job positions. It's also important to note that there is a significant portion of MENA immigrants who are either here as refugees or fleeing war or religious persecution. This means that people who were once professionals or academics in their home country must now leave that experience behind and start anew in the US, and thus become stratified often in lower income jobs. Whew, That was a ton of information. Okay, so to recap, we learned a little bit about the huge wealth gap between Asians in America. We also looked at how little info there is on Middle Eastern Americans and immigrants, and examined that while poverty rates in African immigrant communities are higher than the national average, they are often not perceived to be as such. The fact of the matter is, all model minorities face economic disparities in the United States that get overlooked. We just rummaged through countless stats, each only showing a limited picture of how we box people into cookie-cutter stereotypes of success, which are more than often not true. But we as Asians are more than a statistic. We as model minorities are more than a statistic. We are a multitude of stories. And for those of us who do hold the privilege and the wealth and the economic mobility in our community, it becomes more important for you to express support for those of us who don't. That means East Asians checking their friends when they see South Asians and Southeast Asians being left out of the conversation. That means demanding more access to resources for our communities, however big or small. And that means taking the knowledge that we learned and using it to educate others and unravel the bias in our society. I also want to openly say that Asians are not to be used as a pawn in America's history of racial and economic oppression. I hope I'm not coming off with this episode as painting Asian success or wealth as a bad thing, because it's not. When Asians succeed, I am indeed glad to hear, just like every other racially and economically oppressed group in America. That's why solidarity and recognition of those who don't is so important. Speaking of which, I'm going to be doing a deep dive into the history of Asians and African immigrants being used as a racial wedge in our next episode to address things from anti-blackness in our communities to the LA race riots to living as a brown person in post-9/11 America. And that brings me to the end of this week's episode. If you want to give some feedback or request an episode on Crazy Rich Asians, head over to my Facebook page called Model Minority Uniquely American. Also, if you like what you hear and you want to support, check out my Patreon, which is linked on my website and on my Facebook page. Model Minority was created, written, and produced by yours truly, Nidhi Shastri. All of our music comes from Purple Planet and the CC Creative Commons. I can't wait to interact with you all as we move through this series. So, as always, shukriya, thank you for listening, and I'm glad to have you here.